Hello, I'm DJ Milam, the author of Lightpath, and for your convenience and pleasure, perhaps wondering if you're interested in the book, I thought I'd take the opportunity to read the first few pages. I'm not going to copy and paste, so it's going to be a one-run as she goes situation. Hope you enjoy it, and I hope the errors are few. Lightpath by DJ Milam, Chapter 1. Kinsey was, without a doubt, quite an attractive young lady. She was in high school, and while she would live to attend her senior prom in a few weeks, it was certain she would not live to enjoy college. Cancer, you see. A brain tumor, to be exact. She tried to keep her spirits up for her family's sake, but it was becoming more difficult. She was becoming weak. Her latest doctor visit, accompanied by her mother, thoroughly wearied and barely holding it together, and her grandmother, altogether dejected but covering well, had done nothing to energize Kinsey or encourage her. Quite the opposite, in fact. Yet another doctor that shook his head sadly, waved his hands futilely, and spoke with hollow enthusiasm of new treatment, possibly in just months. However, he conveniently failed to mention that even a few months could be too late for Kinsey. She was a bit young to be cynical, but not too young to be disappointed. Disappointed and tired, that's how she felt most often. She did have two things going for her, however, her family and, more recently, her dreams. Just a few weeks ago, she'd begun having dreams, and that resurrected her attitude considerably. One clutched at any hope in these situations, you know. Her family was well off, but not rich. Richard Carlson, her grandfather, a towering man physically and mentally, had started work as a roughneck in the Texas oil fields just out of high school. He'd worked hard at his job and even harder at night school. He was the first in his family to complete college and was quickly moved into a low-level management position that used his keen mind as well as his ability to get along well with the other roughnecks. He persevered academically and achieved his MBA soon afterward and achieved more upward movement. Shell Oil loved him, both his managers above and his field men below him. Onward and upward, Richard Carlson climbed through life. He took along his high school sweetheart, and together they ascended consistently through both the perils and potentials of life. A great job with a company he truly loved, and the best wife. Well, the best he'd ever had, he often told people with his big, friendly smile. They had one son, quite like his father, but in a slightly smaller frame, who, like his father, worked hard, studied even harder, and was also appreciated by those above and below him in his field of expertise, which was not oil. Between the two generations, it was an amazing upward trek. No scandals, no enemies, no major problems at all. Until Kinsey's cancer, that is. They couldn't outwork the cancer, though, nor could they outstudy it. And they were beginning to acknowledge that cancer was going to take their lovely young Kinsey. They were fine people, but they weren't having strange, unusual dreams. So, unlike Kinsey, they had little reason left for hope. Nearing home from their last disappointing visit at the MD Anderson Cancer Clinic Center, Kinsey saw her grandfather sitting on the porch waiting for them. "Grandma," Kinsey asked quietly from the back seat, "who is that man with Grandpa?" "What man, honey?" her grandmother asked distractedly. At her age, safe driving required complete focus on the road. "I believe he's from the neighborhood, Kinsey," her mother, who was thrilled with any reason not to watch Grandma Carlson drive, responded. "Seems like I've seen him walking and biking around here. Looks like he and Dad are having a nice chat." Kinsey hoped so. The man seated near her grandfather was the same man she had seen recently in her dreams. She smiled and laughed softly. He looked so normal, having a nice chat on the porch with her grandfather. Well, he looked normal now. But in her dreams, when he touched people, strange things happened. Sometimes the people he touched staggered. Occasionally, they even fell to the ground. She could sense unusual power flaring up when he touched people. Some people wept, while others laughed. In one dream, he touched someone in a darkened room, an elderly lady in a hospital room at night from the looks of it. And the effect was almost like that of the lightsabers in Star Wars. There was no humming sound, but Kinsey saw a strange blue glow that had enveloped both the man and the woman he had touched. Like most of us, Kinsey had dreamed off and on her entire life. Like some of us, she occasionally recalled her dreams during times of wakefulness. But these recent dreams were different. They were lifelike. They remained with her when she awoke. And unlike any of her other recent experiences, they filled her with an unusual sense of ebullience. Her dreams infused her with hope. And she was now looking at the man who consistently played a central part in her dreams. Perhaps he's a healer, she said quietly to herself. The word healer wasn't part of her family's usual vocabulary, and she couldn't recall ever using the word like this before. Her family wasn't the church-going type. Interesting, she thought to herself. Very interesting. I'm experiencing real people that I first met in my dreams. She decided not to tell anyone about this. Well, not yet at least. Besides, she said to herself with a small smile, he looks perfectly ordinary, just so normal sitting there next to Grandpa. Kinsey was young, though. She hadn't yet learned how deceiving looks could be. The man on the porch would probably appear ordinary to most. He labored to deliver that impression. Truly, though, he was anything but ordinary. His strange skill set, his compassion, focus, occasional flashes of anger, and the physical manifestations of supernatural power, these all marked him as quite the unique individual. He wasn't ordinary, and he certainly wasn't normal. Far, far from it. He was, well, strange. As the car pulled into the driveway of the Carlson home, the attention and gaze of the two men on the porch coincided with that of the three women in the car. The eyes of Kinsey and the stranger on the porch held each other for a moment. The young girl smiled broadly and comfortably at him, and suddenly realized she was feeling a strange heat at the back of her head. Absent-mindedly, she began to run her hand over the spot. All her full, gorgeous brown hair was gone from the lethal chemotherapy she'd recently undergone, and her scalp was most often cold, rarely warm, and never hot like this. As the car rolled to a stop and the ladies began to get out, Grandma Carlson said, "Oh, that's a neighbor from down the way. I think his name is Dan, or maybe David." The stranger, and his name was David, glanced and smiled quickly at Kinsey's grandmother and mother. Then he again looked at Kinsey. He smiled at her, and as a noticeable charge of energy ignited within him, he casually raised one thumb and wiggled it for the benefit of the young girl. He wanted her to know everything was going to be all right. David suddenly realized that a transformation of sorts was happening within himself. The back of his head, the spot where some men begin to lose their hair, was beginning to heat up like Kinsey's, and the palms of his hands were beginning to itch. He'd experienced these indicators before, and they served to alert him. He'd been shocked to see Kinsey rubbing the back of her head just moments ago. Well, that's a surprise, he thought to himself. She must have some power working within her, too. He'd spoken with others that experienced these warning indicators, but he rarely saw anyone exhibit them, and he certainly wasn't expecting it here. Minutes earlier, for the last week or so, as I'd walked and jogged here, I'd noticed something unusual in a specific area. I finally realized it was the elusive scent of a miracle, and it was lingering around this one particular home. Yes, the potential for a miracle was here, and I'd been nosing around it for days. Have you ever chased a miracle or looked for one? I remember visiting a large old church in central Romania. It was hundreds of years old, with the usual marvelous artwork common to many old European churches. The artwork didn't impress me, but the flagstone floor did. The stones of the floor, originally laid quite smooth, had been worn down inches by people chasing their own miracle. I remember thinking as I looked at that worn floor, I wonder how many found their miracle. I intended to find mine today. Exactly what does a miracle smell like? It's a very complex, heady scent, varying parts of need, desperation, and hope, with a little anxiety often added to the mix. The odor can carry elements of depression and the premature, rancid stench of death as well. Sadly, altogether too few recognize the scent of a miracle these days. Perhaps that's why so few appear. One doesn't often see into the spirit world, but if one is very sensitive, they may detect the strange, compelling aroma of the supernatural. And when properly trained, you can usually tell when you're close to it. Right now, I was relentlessly pursuing a miracle, one of epic proportions, if I was sensing things right. Unfortunately, the moment the door opened, I felt more like an unwanted stranger than a grade A miracle chaser. Ah, well, such is life. My life, at least. I plunged right in. "Hi, I'm David, a neighbor from a couple of streets over," I said with a smile and a wave indicating something to the right of where I was standing. I sensed major underlying tension long before the guy who opened the door coolly framed his response. And that means exactly what to me? "Good point, jerk," is what I wanted to say. I was frustrated and embarrassed, because it's a bit hard to explain that you've been smelling a miracle in the area for the last few days and you feel one is close by, especially if you're explaining this to someone who hasn't ever experienced a miracle. I suddenly remembered a wise old Christian minister who had spent many years as a missionary in Africa. I clearly recalled him saying, "I've never had a comfortable miracle yet." Fitting, I suppose. I wasn't feeling very comfortable right now, but chasing a miracle often removes one from their comfort zone. "Rich, why don't you call the ladies, check on their progress, and let me have a word with my neighbor?" Fortunately, an older man gently inserted himself into our little standoff, and as Rich slowly turned away and retreated into the house, the large newcomer replaced him at the door and kindly smiled at me. I made a conscious effort to relax, softening my posture and my facial features and allowing a genial smile to spread across my face. "Thank you," I said softly. "I don't want to be a bother, but I did want to stop by and speak with you for a few moments. By the way, I'm Richard Carlson," my neighbor said as he opened the door fully and joined me on his front porch. "I'm David Lillard. I live over on Big Cedar, just a couple blocks away," I responded, again waving at the direction I'd come from. Richard laughed softly. "Yep, I recognize you. I've seen you and your lady walking from time to time. I believe I've also seen you at some homeowners meetings. And what brings you by today, David?" His voice was calm, but his gaze was piercing. I reckoned that he wasn't a man I'd want to irritate. Richard slowly eased himself into a chair on the porch and beckoned for me to occupy one nearby. As I seated myself and looked closely at him, I sensed something more than just his piercing gaze. I sensed an openness, a hunger, almost as though an invisible hand was reaching toward me. This is just what I'd hoped for. It's what I needed. Richard, I'll readily admit that I don't know exactly why I'm here, but I do know, or feel rather, that someone in your home is having a serious issue, probably a major illness. I'm here to offer help. Richard sat still and observed me for what seemed like a long time. In situations like this, where one party doesn't know the other well, pregnant pauses like this seem to last interminably. "And what sort of help are you here to offer?" he finally asked. His gaze, which was unwavering, conveyed serious intellect mixed with a wearied hopefulness. Again, I thought, this is exactly what I need. "Richard, I need you to trust me, please. I'm not a whack job, and I don't want money. I believe in miracles. And I have what you might call a supernatural ability to invoke wellness into hopeless physical situations. I sense or feel that your family needs what I have to offer. All I'm asking is that you'll allow me to spend 5 or 10 minutes with the party in your home that needs help." I looked as calm as I could, considering the unnatural nature of my request. I wanted to appear confident and powerful, but that's a bit hard to pull off. Confident and calm is what I hoped to convey. Either my attempt to project an aura of power and confidence was working, or Richard was desperate and ready to try anything. At any rate, I sensed he was going to give me an opportunity to do my thing. "All right, David, here's the present situation in our household. You first met my son, Rich. He lives in the area but has been staying with us some. My wife, Rich's wife, and Kinsey, his daughter, are on their way back from MD Anderson, the cancer center. Kinsey, my granddaughter, has cancer, specifically a brain tumor. When they get here, I'll give you a moment with them, if they're not too tired, that is." The MD Anderson Cancer Clinic is a world-renowned cancer clinic in downtown Houston, about 30 miles away. If Rich's daughter was there for treatment or analysis, her condition was indeed dire. "Thanks, Richard. That's all I'm asking for. Just a few minutes of you folks' time. And David," he added with a tight grin, "if you do wind up with something to sell or you're running a scam, you'd better be quite fleet of foot. My son is a bit tense. Well, we all are. And I'd hate to be your sorry hide if you're jerking us around." I had to smile. In fact, I laughed out loud, and it seemed to be the right response for Richard. "No problem, Mr. Carlson. I don't enjoy introducing myself into these circumstances, but I appreciate your trust. I won't abuse it either." Before I could say more, a Lexus sedan pulled quietly into the driveway. Richard's wife, the senior Mrs. Carlson, was the first to exit the car. She was not a young woman, and she appeared weighted down, her shoulders slumped, every movement indicating weariness and depression, or both. When she finally pulled herself erect outside the automobile, she looked directly at Richard and shook her head in a definite and disparaging no. Richard, standing next to me, muttered, "Well, this doesn't look good. Today's visit with the doctor was supposed to be our last hope down at Anderson. We were afraid things weren't going well." Richard's wife, being of advanced years, didn't seem to see me standing next to her husband. Her mind was on other things: hopelessness, weakness, childhood lost, death. I watched her closely, and it seemed she somehow pulled herself upright, swung open the back door of the car, and I heard her call energetically, "Come on, Princess. We'll all feel better after we've had a little something to eat." A good-looking woman, I assumed to be Valerie, Rich's wife, joined Grandma Carlson at the door, waiting for Kinsey to exit the car. Shocked, I saw a stick-thin figure emerge, almost as if in slow motion. I'd have guessed the girl to be in high school. In fact, I thought she looked vaguely familiar. The girl, whom I assumed to be Kinsey, was entirely bald, but carried a cap in her hand. Her lack of hair made her eyes seem unusually large, and although obviously ill, her beauty, like her mother's, was still apparent. She reached one hand to her grandmother, the other to her mom, and the three began their slow walk toward the porch where Richard and I stood. Her eyes, the girl's and mine, had met as they pulled into the driveway. At one point, she was looking closely at me with the cutest little smile on her face, and I had raised one thumb and kind of waggled it at her. She saw it, her smile widened just a bit more, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. I felt compassion and anger beginning to surge within me. I feel that children, innocent children, should never have to face a devastating disease like cancer. I know that life isn't fair, and that's why I'm here. You can call me an equalizer. I'm here to average out some of the negative things that happen in life. I'm here to enable people that have experienced negative things to encounter feeling good again. I have unusual power, and these people needed it. Two physical changes began occurring simultaneously within my body. The back of my head had begun to feel very warm, and my palms began to itch. Both were indicators that power was welling up within me. Suddenly, I realized I was no longer chasing a miracle. I had one in my hands. That's why they were itching. Apparently, my ability to sense needs and utilize supernatural power is a part of me, a growing part actually. And it begins with compassion. Compassion is what distinguishes me from others. There are more than you may realize that are somewhat like me. I'm quite emotional, and my emotions seem to feed my very unique skill set. The malady that was taking over this girl's life was going to encounter defeat, and I was going to remember the moment, savor it, and enjoy it for a long time. The three ladies, one elderly, one middle-aged, and one young, finally reached the porch, and I decided that now was the best time for action. An important part of working a miracle is picking your moment. I didn't want the family to become maudlin as they focused on a doctor's grim negative report, so I decided to use an element of surprise right on their front porch before they got inside the house. "Richard, ladies, I'm only going to take a moment of your time," I began before Richard or the ladies could object. I then met Kinsey with a smile as she climbed the steps and reached the porch. "Kinsey, my name is David, and I believe in miracles. I'm a neighbor of your grandparents and wanted to come over and spend a moment with you. I believe something special is going to happen to you now." I smiled as confidently as I could while holding pleasant eye contact with her. My father was a Pentecostal pastor, and it was in Pentecostal churches that I discovered my skill set. Sadly, most churches that I visit now prohibit the kind of power that I was going to utilize in the next few moments. The majority of churches that I've observed recently are preoccupied with the power of money and the pastor's ego. A genuinely gifted pastor that is actually able to minister is rare. And because of this, most churches today no longer experience much in the way of healing. A shame that they've fallen so far from the example and pattern of Jesus and the apostles. Do I have a grudge against pastors today? I hope not, but fear that I may. So many pastors today are managers, not ministers. I have been shunned, insulted, and hindered to the point of failure by so many ministers. There isn't a lot of respect left in me, I'm afraid. Regardless of my dislike for pastors and disappointment in churches, I still find one-on-one prayer to be the simplest conduit to generate healing. I'd really have liked an organ humming softly in the background with bass and drums and someone softly singing, "There is no telling what God can do if you believe." Instead, the only sound I heard was a slight creak as I stepped forward on the wood porch of the Carlsons' home. Kenzie's response shocked me. It was almost like she was expecting me, like we'd met before. "Whatever you do is fine, sir. If my grandfather trusts you, that's good enough for me." She then leaned forward and whispered softly, "I've seen you in several dreams in the last few weeks. I've seen people shake, laugh, cry, and even fall when you touch them. I know you have power, so do your thing." She stepped back and smiled expectantly. I was a bit nonplussed. I was prepped to try and convince her that something was going to happen, and of all things, she was a step ahead of me. Strange. Very strange. I went on as though she'd said nothing to me, best for her folks to know my game plan. "Okay, Kenzie, I'm going to impart some power to you. The words that I'll speak are from another language, so you'll probably not understand them, but you're going to feel warmth, and it is going to gather where your illness is located. When you feel it, I want you to know that something wonderful is happening. The warmth indicates power, and the power that I unleash is not only going to warm you, but it's going to defeat your cancer. We're going to win." Again, I smiled confidently. If you'd looked real closely, you'd have seen that my smile was a bit tight. I wasn't really experiencing joy. I was in the process of kicking cancer's butt. The smile was only to make those around me feel comfortable. Then, right there on the front porch, I reached out and laid one hand on the top of Kenzie's head, and with the other I reached around her back and supported her. Occasionally, people fall when they experience the power I would soon share. You can never tell how a person will respond to the supernatural. A hand supporting the back and ready to catch someone falling is always a good idea. As I began to speak, choosing another language so that I could exert authority and address the illness without frightening Kenzie or her family, I soundly rebuked cancer. I informed it that it was no longer welcome and that I was, in fact, commanding it to leave instantly. I did this with confidence and strength, but not volume. I was taking authority in the spiritual realm, not trying to deafen any of the people around me. I then loosed or invited a spirit of wellness upon and within not only Kenzie, but also her parents and grandparents. When one has experienced an element of the supernatural, it is important to acknowledge any positive change. If not acknowledged, the positive change can slip away. Knowing this, I always like to press for some positive acknowledgement. So I simply said, "Something good has happened here. Kenzie, do you believe you're better?" "Yes," she replied with emphasis and a charming smile. "I believe." "Mr. Carlson, do you believe?" I asked as I rose back to my full height. "Yes," he responded, "I believe." I noticed he was wiping tears, not only from his eyes, but errant streams that were running down his cheeks as well. "Mrs. Carlson," I then asked Kenzie's grandmother, now with a smile on my face, "do you believe?" "I believe," she said with gusto. "Thank you, Mrs. Carlson. I responded, "And if you'll pardon me for saying so, you look like you've been through the ringer. I'd like to share a moment with you as well." Before she could say anything, I moved forward and gently laid my hands on her shoulders. "I restored the strength which has waned in recent times," I said softly. I felt her jerk as though she had been shocked by a live wire. And just that quickly, I turned to Valerie, her daughter-in-law. I'd sensed that Mrs. Carlson was weary, but my major concern, other than Kinsey, was Valerie. There were some things wrong with her, and it was obvious to me now that I stood near. I sensed guilt, and there was a lot of anger as well. I sensed Valerie would be more receptive to me after I'd had a similar moment with the others. "Valerie," I began softly but with firmness, "there are needs in your life as well." I leaned forward and spoke softly and directly into one ear. "You need to forgive yourself. Your guilt is raging. No one expects cancer in a teen, and you need to let the anger that you're harboring go. Anger like you have will make you very ill, and it will prove harmful in many areas of your life." Then, without another word, I reached for Valerie the same way I had her daughter Kinsey, one hand on her head and another supporting her backing. As I began to speak, I again chose another language. I informed guilt that it no longer had a place to reside in Valerie, and then I addressed the anger. I commanded anger, as I had guilt, to go, and then invited peace and love to replace the two negative emotions I was banishing. When I ceased speaking, I opened my eyes. Valerie was staring at me with a wondrous expression of joy beginning to spread all over her face. I moved back quickly before she could put a big hug and a kiss on me. Trust me, it's happened before. With a grin, I looked back at her and said softly, "Don't worry, I'll send you the bill later," and then laughed as I patted her hands. "How do you feel, Kinsey?" I asked, turning back to the young girl. "I feel fantastic," she said with a huge smile. Amazingly, she already appeared stronger and more robust. "And I'm hungry. I can't remember being this hungry in forever. Grandpa," she said as she looked imploringly up at Mr. Carlson, "can we go to Whataburger?" She may have actually batted her eyes. She definitely wanted a Whataburger. Mr. Carlson was speechless. Well, for a moment at least. Then, with an expression of wonder that turned quickly to joy, he looked around and said haltingly, "Well, that's the last thing I expected to hear from Kinsey today. Come on, folks, Whataburger it is!" I noticed tears of joy flowing out of his wife's eyes as she leaned down and hugged Kinsey. "This is wonderful, honey," she cried. "I can't remember the last time I heard you say you were hungry." Valerie was just as shocked as her in-laws. "I can't believe it," she exclaimed as she looked at me. "Is Kinsey well? Is this a miracle?" "Yes," I said with a quick smile. "Yes, I'm certain that Kinsey is well. She is healthy and will regain her strength very quickly. Let me warn you, the medical experts will want to know how. Not that I blame them, but don't let them ruin Kinsey's life with an endless array of tests. She's well, and eventually they'll have to admit they can't explain it from a medical standpoint. At some point, you may need to finally say, please, no more needles and no more tests. We have experienced a miracle. Let us all enjoy her well-being." I started down the steps, then turned before leaving. "Mr. Carlson, thank you for letting me have this time with your family. Please explain to Rich that there are no hard feelings. I fully understand the difficult time he's been experiencing. Things will change quickly in the next few days. Enjoy the difference." I then heard a voice say quite distinctly, "Oh, Mr. Lillard." I turned and looked at Kinsey, who was standing just a bit closer to me than her family. She flashed a megawatt smile at me and then said, "Thank you. And tell Marcus that I say hi. I just figured out who you were. Your son and I are tight. I sit next to him in chemistry, and you two have very similar mannerisms. But he's much cuter," she said with a big grin on her face, which, to my way of thinking, wasn't quite so charming as it had been before. Of course, she was kidding with me about my son being cuter, wasn't she? Suddenly, and it hit me like a ton of bricks, I recognized Kinsey and recalled her as she used to be when healthy, a cheerleader with long, luxurious strands of dark brown hair. She looked like a different girl now, thin and hairless. I was speechless. I was so surprised. So with a grin at Kinsey and a final wave to them all, I left and began the short walk to my home. I ignored their call for me to enter their home. I'd be back in a few days to see them, but I wanted to let them enjoy their miracle and feel the joy and hope of health once again. As I walked the few blocks toward my home, I savored the sweet taste of victory. The only downside was remembering past times, some quite similar, where I hadn't vanquished cancer. I found myself wondering, why was today different? I felt more confident and powerful than I had in the past. But why? In the back of my mind, I replayed the wonder and joy that had erupted across the faces of Mr. and Mrs. Carlson, Valerie, and Kinsey, their delight and surprise at their positive experience was heartwarming. Finally, though, the smile left my face. Enough of this delightful post-miracle memories. I was ready to move on. I mean, really move on. I had a suicide to plan. Suicide isn't quite the right term. I guess a planned medical death is more accurate. My life was largely a failure, notwithstanding the occasional miracle, and I could bear my life no longer. Death, my death, was imminent. Well, I hope you've enjoyed. That's the first few pages of Lightpath. When I wrote the book, I wept many times and laughed many times as well. I tried to inject as much humor as I could. Basically, I think it's a story of hope, but it's a story of pathos as well. There are challenges, difficult challenges, that many in our world have to face. And so Lightpath is waiting for you at the Kindle bookstore. And perhaps, if I'm lucky and it sells well enough and enough people give it a good review, perhaps some local stores near you will carry it. You can order it for the Kindle or you can get it in a paperback. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to know more about me, you can go to djmilam.com. There will be a link there for my Facebook page and also some YouTube videos other than this that I have. I hope you've liked this time together. Hope your curiosity is piqued about my book, Lightpath. I'm proud of it. And I hope you visit the Kindle bookstore and purchase it. Thanks so much for your time. I do hope you'll have a wonderful day and an even greater future.